Thank you, everybody. Thank you, John. In fact, I knew John's work for many, many years before I met him, and his great work in popular music studies and his textbook. But we actually met over a very exciting debate over why Yes is not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I woke up to eat my eggs one morning, and there was a big editorial in the Cleveland Plain Dealer by John. And we got in a good debate, and we've had a great time getting to know each other. And I'm really, really delighted to be here. And I want to thank Dave, too, for a terrific talk that couldn't match what I'm going to say better. It's as if we planned to talk about these things together, but we didn't. One of the things that's really great about my job is you get to think about questions you hadn't thought about before. And so I do a lot of my scholarship on the blues in Britain in the late 50s and early 60s, and also in how some of the rock and roll bands were responding to American rock and roll, primarily by African American artists. And I was headed in that direction with Son House, and then I woke up one morning and I was laying in bed and I said, why is Son House not in the Hall of Fame? We need to think about this. And a lot of it might have to do with Robert Johnson, actually. So what I want to do here, and I hope generate some good conversation, is to think about what does it mean about the Hall of Fame, about the story of rock and roll as it's typically told, and about how the Hall of Fame represents blues, that Son House is not currently an inductee. That does not mean that someday he would not be, but he is not currently an inductee. And I'm really riffing a little bit off the great Son House performance of Grinnin' in Your Face as I think about these questions. Son House is not inducted, but Robert Johnson is very much inducted. And I'll go through some of these in a minute, but you'll see the very first class of Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees in 1986. Robert Johnson was inducted as an early influence. So if we think about the group of folks who put together nominees each year and the Hall of Fame, and this is certainly an issue that is of debate and interest among lots of folks, Robert Johnson was one of those people who was really kind of considered a no-brainer as an inductee, as a legend in rock and roll. And I think Dave actually got at some very, very interesting things in why that is. Even in the Q&A there, thinking about how did Robert Johnson die, right? So we get that question almost as much as the questions I might get about Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain. It seems to me that because we know very little about Robert Johnson and the myth that has been created around Robert Johnson, he seems to be able to fall into a rock and roll narrative. You described in Dave as sort of nascent rock and roll and a troubadour against kind of son's preacher identity in some ways, which I think is just really, really spot on. But it's fascinating how Robert Johnson has been absorbed into a narrative of rock and roll as the descendant, but really very few other bluesmen from his era have, almost nobody. The Hall of Fame has recognized electric blues that comes just a little bit later, but really nobody else from that era. So let me talk a little bit about the process for induction. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Foundation, who the museum, we're in Cleveland, the foundation is based in New York City, they oversee the process, and they have since the very beginning, and that's because they precede the museum. The idea of a Hall of Fame was hatched in 1983 by Ahmet Ertegun, who of course founded Atlantic Records, and Jan Wenner of Rolling Stone magazine. And then the first class of inductees were inducted in 1986. But the museum and the Hall of Fame was not opened until 1995, right? So there's just about a decade of inductions into a Hall of Fame that doesn't quite physically exist. Artists become eligible 25 years after their first recording, and that can be any kind of a release. It's going to be interesting to see what happens to that in the digital era, what will count as a release. There is a nominating committee of about 30 to 35 people. There's a couple of us from the museum, a couple of academics, some artists, music business people, and this group puts together a ballot each year of, say, about 15 artists in the performer category, and then that goes out to a larger larger body of voters, about 700 folks, who induct maybe about 5 to 7 people each year. Now, that larger voting body is also includes all of our living Hall of Fame inductees. So, you know, Buddy Guy gets a vote, for example. But most of the blues folks end up in these other categories. The Ahmet Ertegun Award has been given to non-performers, songwriters, record executives, journalists. Early influences, where we see most of our blues performers. These are artists whose music predates rock and roll, but we consider rock and roll impossible without them. And sidemen, a category that's also morphed into the award for musical excellence. Musicians have, you know, it's not their name on the label typically. And our blues sideman primarily is Little Walter, who many people would argue should be in as a performer. Now, these categories are handled by smaller committees and do not go out to a larger voting body, which is probably a good thing in the sense that they often scoop up perhaps the more obscure or older artists as we move forward and, you know, are kind of addressed by a smaller kind of expert body. Just some quick demographics. We have 304 inductees. That's kind of individual entities, right? So a band, you know, the Beatles equal 1. And that's a breakdown. We have very few women inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And it is primarily, overwhelmingly, a US, Canadian, and UK group. Artists can be inducted more than once. We do not have, well, I was just going to say, we do not have any blues artists on this list, and then I looked at the top, and I said, Eric Clapton is key to this story and his love for Robert Johnson, but nobody else that would really fall into that category per se. These are folks that have been inducted in their first year of eligibility, the people that folks think are just, you know, kind of obvious and sort of waltz in on the first ballot. Again, we're not seeing really very many, you know, strong blues influences in this group, except a couple folks in that very early period. So these are the artists inducted in the early influence category. And it's interesting to look at how this has changed over time. It's actually a category that isn't used as much as it used to be, which I think is unfortunate. So Robert Johnson, Jimmy Yancey, Jimmy Rogers in the first year, Louis Jordan, T-Bone Walker, Hank Williams. There's kind of steady look. So you've got our gospel inductees, country, blues, all the way up until 2000. We've got a steady run of early influence inductees. And then it really stops. And that category has been used a couple of times for people, Wanda Jackson, the great rockabilly singer from the 50s, and Freddie King in 2012 in a new way. They're not really early influence. I mean, Wanda Jackson isn't pre-rock and roll. She is part of rock and roll. And while Freddie King is a great blues player, again, he's not pre-rock and roll. The Five Royales, a great early R&B vocal group, went in this year, and they kind of go back to that sense a little bit of early influence. So one of the things this shows us is that the institution at some point seemed to decide that it had taken care of this category, right? That we had kind of covered everyone we should in the early influence category and didn't need to worry about those roots any longer. There's a lot of folks missing from that. Thomas Dorsey out of gospel music, the Carter family out of country music, Sister Rosetta Tharpe out of gospel music, Son House certainly, Charlie Patton's not there. And we've even talked about it as a category that perhaps carries a different meaning. For example, it's come up in discussions of how we induct hip-hop artists. Do you induct some artists from the 70s who maybe didn't record, like Kool Herc, as an early influence on hip-hop, right? So what does the category even start to mean? But I think the challenge is we sort of gave up on it at a certain point. Now, this is the thing everybody likes to argue about. How do you actually decide who is the best? We're talking about art, after all. So, aesthetic categories are deeply subjective, but what we go back to, and this is a quote from the chairman of the nominating committee, John Landau, who also is Bruce Springsteen's longtime manager. And he says, we're not dealing primarily with statistical criteria, right? This is not the Baseball Hall of Fame. We're trying to recognize musical quality and excellence. And that's a challenge sometimes when we get into these debates, right? Because people will say, well, how could so-and-so not be inducted? They sold this many records. And we really try to move away from that to talk about what these three categories: musical excellence, innovation, and influence. Even those, I think, though, can be subjective, especially when you're talking about rock and roll. Virtuosity isn't always valued over other things. And if you define excellence by virtuosity, some of the great rock and roll bands, say, for example, punk bands, go away. But when we're thinking of somebody like Son House, in terms of all three of these categories, it seems quite undeniable. And I would think an easy case could have been made back in the day when all of this was being discussed. This is our blues exhibit at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which includes many things that are very typical of what we display: instruments, clothing, stage clothing, sheet music, recordings. And the folks that we display and we can exhibit artists who are not inducted, and we typically do that. So you see there's a Furry Lewis guitar case, and we have his guitar up there. Big Mama Thornton is represented there, but she's not inducted. So you don't have to be inducted to be represented there. But even here, we really do not represent. There's a photograph in the bottom left corner of Robert Johnson and also of Charlie Patton, but we really don't represent any of the kind of acoustic blues guys, most of whom were rediscovered, in the 60s, in our blues exhibit, which I think is interesting. What is it about Son House in particular and this group of blues artists more widely that don't quite fit into the rock and roll narrative? And I think it's because the rock and roll narrative gets told backwards, and Elijah Wald has made a great point about this in his book on Robert Johnson, right? So the blues that matter are the blues that matter to Eric Clapton or that mattered to the Stones, right? So you begin to tell that backwards as opposed to thinking about those roots forward. And I have to tell you, I've been at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for 7 years. We teach the roots of rock and roll to kids. We talk about Son House in that context. I've walked by this case 1,000 times and never noticed that we don't represent Son House here. So to not represent the guy who influences Robert Johnson and who teaches Robert Johnson in the way that Dave mapped out here is really kind of shocking when you sit back and think about that. These are our blues inductees, kind of isolated from early influences. Robert Johnson as an early influence. B.B. King was inducted as a performer. So again, somebody who's recognized kind of in the rock and roll era. T-Bone Walker, Muddy Waters as a performer, could have also been an early influence. Leadbelly, Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, actually surprisingly, given overall how few women are inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I think it's a good representation of those early blues stars, right? That establish a certain kind of celebrity, I think, around the blues that's really important. John Lee Hooker as performer, not early influence. Howlin' Wolf, though, early influence. Jimmy Reed, performer. Elmore James, early influence. Willie Dixon, performer. Buddy Guy. Little Walter, and then I mentioned these more recent folks, Freddie King and Albert King. So very much, the electrified blues, something kind of closer to rock and roll as opposed to the roots. I think there's a few reasons I would say, and maybe like to center our discussion on about how this might have come about. I don't think it's conscious, right? But I think that like many of the other bluesmen who were kind of rediscovered and who recorded again in the 60s and embraced in many ways by the folk boom, Son House was too alive. You couldn't wrap a myth around him. There was the reality of a living, breathing person that resisted, I think, in many ways, white rock and roll fantasies about what the blues was supposed to be or do. And in that sense, he couldn't be maybe imitated in the way that, in easy imitation, the way that the Stones, for example, imitated certain bluesmen. And when I hear a song like Grinnin' in Your Face, which reminds me very much of the Undisputed Truth's Smiling Faces Sometimes, a great hit for Motown, written by Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong, which is a song really thinking about who were the biggest enemies to the civil rights movement by the time we got to the late 60s and early 70s. Was it, Bull Connor, or was it the smiling faces of white liberalism in the North that was putting up barriers to housing, right? And Grinning in Your Face in some ways has a very, very similar warning. So I think there can be maybe some friction about the real living human being in front of you, generations older than you, that somebody like Son House perhaps posed to those who are writing the rock and roll story. We all know this if we know the Son House story, and it wasn't necessarily just true of him, but he's out in front of audiences beginning in 64 and 65 of overwhelmingly white audiences who are very, very quiet. This is very, it becomes almost a kind of academic exercise to watch some of these older bluesmen like they're in a museum case, right? And I think that's complicated as we think about how to account for our musical history within the context of American race relations. But I also think it has something to do with Son House's subject matter and the way in which his material and his stage presence and the extraordinary film that we still have of him grapples with the tension between the religious and the secular, gospel and blues, heaven and hell, God and the devil. It's not a myth. It's not selling your soul at the crossroads. It feels anguished. It feels very real and visceral. And Dave, we had the lyrics there to Preachin' Blues, but not his song, but his performance of John the Revelator. These things, the Preachin' Blues and the long spoken introduction to it that was a set piece for Son House is not something that quite fits into the rock and roll story in many ways. Rock and roll doesn't exist without gospel musically, in terms of the vocal timbre, the fervor, the relationship between performer and audience. But it's the root of rock and roll that I think maybe causes the most discomfort, and especially sometimes for white audiences. We have only 3 inductees, straight up gospel inductees into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame: Mahalia Jackson, the Soul Stirrers, and the Staple Singers. And given the importance of gospel music to virtually every African American soul and R&B inductee that follows them, it's quite surprising. And I think there's a kind of discomfort there at the ways that the sacred and the secular can kind of rub up against each other there for white listeners that kind of can't quite make sense of somebody like Son House. So I think that gospel element there and the way that Son House would preach, and that incredible monologue about you got to decide between God and the devil, that doesn't quite mix with Eric Clapton or the Stones or Led Zeppelin, right? Of really kind of taking that on in the most serious way. So I think that those are really the key ideas for me about why somebody like Son House kind of doesn't fit in a narrative about blues. But I don't think it is a hostility to it. I think the the problem with it is with a place like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you get the opportunity to, preserve some stories, right? And preserve some memories and kind of pass those along. So the artistry that Dave talked about is certainly really important. And I think if Son House were inducted, it would also cast a different light on the Robert Johnson story. He wouldn't be as kind of singular and as much of almost a freak show a little bit, a sensation around some of these questions, and can be seen in a much kind of longer lineage and much more complicated story. So that's some things I just kind of wanted to put on the table about Son House and the early blues in the Hall of Fame. And then I'd really like to see what you all kind of think about that, because I really sort of envision this as a dialogue around kind of Son House in particular, and maybe the blues more widely as a root of rock and roll. So I'll just kind of throw that out there. John?
Questions and comments, and I'll just exercise the moderator prerogative and ask the first one.
Great.
Because I think what is really fascinating to me, and it's probably people of about our age who can sort of begin to appreciate this, is when the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame began, and then when the building was built, it seemed like what it principally was a way of telling stories, as you said, about our culture and about our music. And as you said, it's really focused around a rock and roll filter. So we're seeing it we're seeing the blues the way rock and roll sees it. We're seeing country the way rock and roll sees it, gospel, and all these kinds of things. And all that's fine. But what's interesting is the institution has been there long enough that we can now start looking at it as an indication of our past culture. In other words, looking at looking at what's happened with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame tells us not only something about the Rock Hall and whether Son House should win it, but we'll be able to tease out a lot of values about what we perhaps, tacitly were holding with regard to who we thought were the important. Because a Hall of Fame is very much a culturally negotiated kind of thing. People have to come to it and you make decisions. Or you have a bunch of artists that people don't really care about. They're not going to show up at the museum to see their guitars and their coats and things like that. So it's very interesting that we can now look back at the Hall of Fame in a way that makes it the study of historical, the subject of historical study, and not as a kind of lens through which we view history, although it's that.
Mm-hmm. John, that's a great point. I mean, we're at this 30 years now, right, in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So it has its own story, and the history that we've made now becomes part of that story. And, I always talk about this when people, because I always, joke that, you're out in Cleveland, out to dinner or something, and somebody stops you, a longtime museum member, and they say, "We love your education programs. We're a longtime member." And I say, "Thank you for your support." And then they say, "Do you have one more minute?" And then they, say, "Why isn't so-and-so in?" But, our point of view on these things isn't static. It changes over time. So, I'm really interested in some of the stuff that Jack White has done, for example, and who reveres Son House. Jack White, formerly of the White Stripes, really interested in roots music in sometimes a weird way, I think, but he's got a very different approach to the blues, say, than kind of the Zeppelin Stones did. And I think that the Hall of Fame as an institution out of the gate was really influenced by that kind of 60s electric rock and roll and blues approach to the blues. A similar thing happened around the girl groups in rock and roll, people like the Ronettes and the Shirelles. They were eligible for years before they got in because for a certain time they really weren't considered rock and roll, and the ground shifted a little bit. So yeah, I think that the way that the institution shapes this story does tell us how generation shift, and will there be a kind of renewed interest in some of those blues artists from younger generations, which I think would be really exciting to see.
Other questions or comments?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. That was excellent. I really enjoyed that. But I'm still confused in terms of why it's called rock and roll. On the one hand, as you've explained, it seems to be inclusive, very inclusive. On the other hand, it seems to be exclusive. Son House is not there. I looked for 2005 and it says Percy Sledge, which I don't know if everybody's familiar with Percy Sledge, the OJs, who I don't consider at all to be rock and roll artists. So I'm really confused about how do you define rock and roll, because I'll tell you, I probably associate it with being a white art form or genre or whatever, and these others would be rhythm and blues or something else. Finally, it seems as if rock and roll then subsumes, that all of these other forms are subsumed into rock and roll, which is associated again with more with white culture. So I don't know what kind of question that is.
Fantastic question. A couple of things there. One, we have an enormous tent in the way the institution evolved. So you've got the Rolling Stones and the OJs and Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five and Madonna and ABBA. So we've got a really, really wide tent, which drives some people crazy. But we do. But I think the larger thing you're getting at there too about what, we would define rock and roll as, at its birth, music by African-American artists almost entirely. Little Richard, Fats Domino, Lloyd Price, right? And I think the social phenomenon of it is when a lot of white kids started to listen to that, right? And then you get this explosion. And it seems like the story from that point up until, say, the early to mid 70s is really a story about integration on the charts, so that Otis Redding is sitting side by side the Beatles very comfortably, or Motown and the British stuff. And then in the 70s, you start to see a resegregation on the charts, right? So huge R&B artists like, say, a Luther Vandross or something, is we don't look at to be inducted, but why not, again, if Otis Redding is in a different period? So over that time, rock and roll kind of becomes rock and becomes kind of white music, right? And so we kind of live in the middle of that, I guess. At our best, we keep the tent very, very broad, but I think that's actually harder to do over time, and our audiences can't always make sense of it in that way. But yeah, that's a great, great question, and it kind of lays out the genres. And the other thing I would throw in there, that how we define genres sometimes is very much a creation of the record industry and how they segregate radio and charts, right? So that, it was race music, and then it was sepia music, and then it becomes R&B and all of that, yeah. Thank you. Yes, sir.
As one of the people that is driven crazy by the name, I've come to think of it as the pop music Hall of Fame rather than rock and roll, because there's so much other stuff in it. You can't dance to a lot of the music by performers that are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So to me, that's pop music instead of rock and roll.
Can you give me an example of somebody you would say you can't dance to that's in?
Oh, not at the moment.
Okay. The pop rock thing is a big one.
You got a list here, right?
Sure. The pop rock thing is a big one, and what we've found a lot of times, and I hear you, I have my beefs too, beyond Sunhouse, but I find that because the definition is very slippery, people often say, well, what's rock or what's rock and roll is what I like, and if I don't like it, it's not rock and roll in a sense, And the thing is, if you go back in the history of the music, rock and roll was never one thing. It was never one thing. It was never one sound. If it's 1955 and 1956, the vocal harmony record out of New York by Frankie Lyman does not sound like the Chuck Berry record out of Chess, does not sound like Sun, does not sound like Fats Domino and Little Richard. And the girl groups wouldn't, often get derided as just pop, and not rock and roll. So I hear you, but I think it's... We mix up those definitions with what we love and don't love. But, people are mad that Madonna's in and things like that.
It seems to me that one of the problems generally is that the judgment based on those three criteria that you put on the screen is a qualitative judgment, not a quantitative judgment.
Yep.
It really would be easier if it was how many charts and how many gold records and all that crap. But then you get into, that's where the arguments come in, because, for example, my own personal example is, how can Kiss possibly be any better than Little Feat? I'm sorry, I don't get it. It drives me nuts. and so that's actually the big challenge, right? Is the fact that it is a subjective thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And people feel really passionately. I mean, Kiss fans almost stormed the gates till they got in, for us. Very passionate about that. Our former CEO, Terry Stewart, who retired a couple of years ago, he was head of the institution for about 10 years. He would always say a great thing. I found it very useful myself as a voting member, which was to say, make a case for an artist who you think should be inducted, who you don't like. It's like, okay, that's a really good exercise because now I can think about making an argument for and detaching it. But you can't take out your own personal. I also think you can't take yourself out of maybe your own time and place and how your own tastes are constructed. And I think that's what we see here too, a vision of the blues constructed by a particular generation. Do you have one that you can't? The Bee Gees.
Now, the Bee Gees did a lot of beautiful music in the 60s. You could dance to their music after they went disco. Right. But disco's not rock and roll, is it?
I think disco's really important. And I would, I'm very happy that Donna Summer's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Important, yes. Rock and roll, I'll debate that.
Yeah, John, you want to call them, folks?
Feel bad, every time you find somebody and you've influenced before, before, you end up with these gentlemen here. And that's why I say myself. And before it, the men, the women, that's Smith, Maori, because you don't have the recordings before that, like the teens, the zeros, and then when I see that he's not there, one of my phones all the time, I'm like, if you peel back, this is what you end up with, and then you ask why. And I just can't understand why.
Yeah, and I think we have to find ways to advocate for, say, someone like Son House, especially as we move forward historically, because fewer and fewer people may know them, So they're almost like you need a, the Baseball Hall of Fame has like an old timers committee or something. People that, again, it's not going to sell a ticket to anything, but it needs to be. And again, now we would talk about Son House, collect materials in our library and archives, teach about him. It's not like he's ignored, but that brand of inductee is important in that way.
So as it evolves, as it goes along, like when you go back, like I said, I don't know if anything has come up on Willie Brown. There's so little of Willie Brown, but nobody knows. Nobody talks about it.
We're up against 4 o'clock, so let's just go with maybe Skip and then this fellow here.
Yeah, mine's a quick one. Two of your four points were, and I'm paraphrasing, but 2 of your 4 points were guilt, white guilt, and discomfort with religious overtones. So with that recognition and in the evolution, it seems to me that you're building your own case to put him in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So in the meantime, maybe we could slip one of those artifacts into that police case?
Yeah, you're right.
Okay.
Agreed.
Last question.
Well, while we're talking about how to define rock and roll, let's look at how we define blues, for that matter. There's been an evolution in thinking about that, too. For instance, in the 1950s, blues was really thought of as the roots of jazz. In fact, the Delmark label touted their blues artists as kind of raw material for what became jazz. But today, and this is a phenomenon that's taken place since the 1970s, how to incorporate soul music into blues. Well, now we have soul blues, which interestingly is a black music with a black light, as opposed to what we now call roots rock and roll or Americana music or things like that, or blues rock that appeal to whites. So you have a very, very interesting evolution going on there too.
Sure. Americana's a funny genre to me. It's like, how could we have something called Americana that has almost no kind of African American artists in that category? So let's rethink that one.
Well, let's once again thank
you, everybody.